Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG. Tonight I am joined by Curtis Daly. Curtis, how are you doing this afternoon?
Oh, I'm doing fantastic, and I'm really glad to be back on the show, of course, with you hosting tonight. I think we've got a lot to cover, so I'm really excited for the show.
Thank you very much for joining me this evening, Curtis. Coming up tonight, Israel's war crimes come into question again, a roundup of the various economic news, the complex issue of hyperinflation in Gaza. I speak to economist Francis Coppola about that, and Labour has shockingly suspended 4 MPs. Stay tuned for all of that and more. If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support, and make sure that you can always let us know your comments in the YouTube chat, or indeed you can tweet at us on the hashtag NovaraLive. Now, before we start, we have an event coming up that you won't want to miss. For our next Downstream IRL, Ash Sarkar will be in conversation with historian William Dalrymple about how the East made the West. So join us at 7 p.m. on the 29th of July at Earth Theatre Hackney. You'll find a link to tickets in the description. Yesterday, ministers and officials from 30 countries gathered in Bogota, Colombia, for a 2-day emergency conference aimed at ending Israel's flagrant violations of international law. The meeting was convened by the Hague Group, an organization founded in January 2025 by 9 Global South member states and co-chaired by Colombia and South Africa, to uphold rulings of the ICC and ICJ relating to Israel and Palestine. Countries represented at the conference today include Norway, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, China, Egypt, and Qatar. The group's website describes the purpose of the conference as follows. The emergency meeting has been convened in response to Israel's ongoing and escalating violations of international law in the occupied Palestinian territory, including the crime of genocide, and will focus on the coordinated legal and diplomatic measures to bring them to an end. UN Special Rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territories, Francesca Albanese, who was recently sanctioned by the US government for her UN work, described the conference as, quote, the most significant political development in the past 20 months, while delivering the event's opening address. She called for each state to, quote, immediately review and suspend all ties with Israel, clarifying that this must and should include, quote, military, strategic, political, diplomatic, and economic relations, both imports and exports. Later in the day, she answered questions from journalists on the nature of international complicity.
I do believe that the US is totally complicit with whatever Israel is doing, but to the point that with the new administration, even the forced displacement of the Palestinians, which has occurred for decades under the watch of everyone, including the United States, has become part of the US foreign policy, while declaring that Gaza is a construction site, is to be turned into the Gaza Riviera and the Riviera of the Mediterranean Sea. And also the US is clear, not only has provided weapons, is the first arms suppliers of Israel, followed by Germany, against which there is a pending case for genocide, by the way, but has also provided political support and is really engaging into mafia-style intimidation of so many who are trying to stop it.
It's currently unclear what concrete measures the Hague Group is proposing, though an announcement is expected soon. Yesterday, officials from participating countries met privately to discuss the proposals, and Francesca Albanese also provided her expertise. In a statement to Dropsite News, the US State Department strongly condemned the meeting. The United States strongly opposes efforts by so-called multilateral blocs to weaponize international law as a tool to advance radical anti-Western agendas. The so-called Hague Group, whose leading voices are South Africa and Cuba, authoritarian and communist regimes respectively, with deeply troubling human rights records, seek to undermine the sovereignty of democratic nations by isolating and attempting to delegitimate Israel, transparently laying the groundwork for targeting the United States, our military, and our allies. Now, the idea of weaponizing international law is something that is crazy to me. That you can't weaponize laws, like laws are there for a reason. And second of all, the idea that other countries are authoritarian outside of the United States, currently one blackbagging its own citizens for protected speech, it really is beyond the pale hypocrisy. Now, obviously, it is completely unsurprising that the US opposes efforts to enforce international law against its allies. This is a country that's had the Hague Invasion Act, which authorizes the use of military force to free citizens of the United States or allied countries detained by the International Criminal Court on its books since 2002. Last week, when Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced sanctions on Francesca Albanese, he said it was in response to her, quote, illegal and shameful efforts to prompt International Criminal Court action against US and Israeli officials and companies and executives. A related story that's flown relatively under the radar is that in the days surrounding the US's announcement of sanctions on Albanese, all 3 members of the UN Commission investigating Israel quietly resigned. Pro-Israel lobby group UN Watch reported the news as follows. UN Watch hails resignation of entire UN's anti-Israel inquiry. This is all due to US sanctions on Albanese. Dominoes are falling. In February, Chief Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court Karim Khan was also sanctioned by the US after he issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Israeli Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant. And Middle East Eye has now revealed that in May, British-Israeli defense lawyer Nicholas Kaufman told Karim Khan that if the arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant were not withdrawn, both he and the ICC would both be, quote, destroyed. The fact the Hague Group conference is taking place in Colombia is also significant. Last year, Colombian President Gustavo Petro cut diplomatic ties with Israel over the genocide in Gaza, and relations with the US have been rocky since the first weeks of the Trump administration, when Petro refused to allow 2 US military planes carrying deported Colombian citizens to land on Colombian soil. He subsequently backed down after Trump imposed 25% tariffs on all of the country's exports. In recent weeks, tensions have further escalated, with both countries recalling their respective ambassadors. So the symbolism of the location is very stark. On one side, there's the brute power of the American empire, and on the other, a coalition of predominantly, but not exclusively, global South countries, which believes in something other than might makes right, and they're trying their best to push for the consistent application of international law. Obviously, the stakes could not be any higher. The genocidal violence in Gaza has become routine, to the point that headlines almost seem interchangeable. Today, at least 21 Palestinians were killed at a humanitarian foundation aid distribution site. Every day, it's basically the same story with a different number. At least 66 children have died of malnutrition, and UNRWA says that 1 in 10 children screened in its facilities are now malnourished. Meanwhile, there is no real pressure on Israel from the US, other allies to end the siege. No real pressure to do anything, seemingly. A Palestinian American citizen was recently killed by extremist settlers whilst visiting the West Bank. While US Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee was asked that it would be investigated, he's not backed the family's calls for Washington to launch its own investigation. Of course, Israel rarely holds settlers accountable for violence against Palestinians in the West Bank. Settler violence is, in fact, regularly supervised and enabled by IDF soldiers, and serves the political goals of the Israeli government. Israel has also carried out a series of heavy airstrikes on Damascus today. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio said the US is, quote, very concerned about the escalation in violence, and said it was, quote, a direct threat to the efforts to support and build a stable and non-violent Syria. Curtis, is it realistic to hope the Hague Group announces measures which meaningfully pressure Israel to end the genocide? Do the participating countries even have the power to do that?
Well, actually, I'm going to answer this, but do they have the power? I actually think it's subjective. You might be thinking, why am I saying that? Because clearly international law is objective. Israel is objectively committing a genocide, ethnic cleansing, collective punishment. That's all objective in international law. But it doesn't matter to these people, does it? You can say, well, multiple human rights organizations, multiple nation states are saying you're doing this, and it hasn't stopped them because it's become a narrative war. So, I mean, whether they have the power or not, I don't know. It's kind of hard power versus soft power, right? And it is important. You know, I think Francesca Albanese saying that this is a big step is very encouraging. Of course, she is the UN rapporteur. She is a firebrand, someone I trust, actually. My worry is when you sort of see these, you know, every year have the climate conferences and all these nations get together and they sound very, you know, hopeful and meaningful in you know, in their desire to change policy for the better in terms of protecting the climate. And then afterwards, nothing really gets done. In fact, some climate change conferences invite oil companies, right? So I'm worried this could be the same thing. But I do think it is significant. And there's another reason why I think it's significant, not just because Francesca's saying it, because I think this is potentially a realignment of the global world order. I mean, you've got 30 nation states that aren't just standing up to Israel, by the way. They're standing up to Western hegemony. They're standing up to the US. And I think if you look at the rise of China, for example, look at India as well, I mean, in terms of their productivity, the gains are huge. There's a real realignment here. And I think this sort of signals a wider thing apart from just Israel. And I think also in terms of what Gustavo Petro said, I think it was excellent because he said the time for condemnation is over. We need to take action now, because do you know what? He's right. I am sick of just condemning, whether it's our own government who softly condemns certain things, or other nations say, well, this is clearly bad. Nothing gets done. Materially, policy, that's what matters. So I think it's encouraging to see 30 nations wanting to hold one Israel to account, but also potentially standing up to the current global world order. I mean, look, if we look at Donald Trump at the moment, right? Clearly, a lot of European nations are very, very angry with Trump. What with his his tariff policies, right? And I think that this is a long-term 5-10 year thing where countries are going to start maybe looking at China, maybe realigning with them or having a positive relationship with them. I think that's a good thing. And looking at the US is not so much as a big ally. Now, of course, where does that leave the UK? It's quite complicated for the UK. Not that I'm giving any excuses to Keir Starmer, right? We're kind of stuck in the middle because Keir Starmer desperately wants to maintain that special relationship with Donald Trump. Of course, Trump is coming over in September, but also he is a big supporter of European nations and the EU. He's sort of caught in the middle. So where is the UK going to go on this? For me, I think that Keir Starmer is someone who's so subservient to power, and clearly Trump has the hard power here. Starmer is going to continue to sort of suck up to Trump. I mean, that's why Trump likes him, right? He says he's a very good guy. He's a liberal, but I like him. I think that's what's going to happen. But I do think this is a genuine question over the current global powers and maybe a huge realignment here. But it remains to be seen if any action is taken on this.
It's interesting as well, in the international law as a concept was created by the global north as a way of curtailing the actions of the global south, right? They never expect it to be used against them. And it's really important for these kind of global south countries to actually stand up for a lot of the precepts of international law. These really important things that they should be adhered to regardless of which part of the world that you're from. There's a delicious irony, really, in that you look at these countries that have continually been at the mercy of policies from the global north, wanting to come together and show collective strength to try and resist what is American unipolarity trying to dictate the terms of how geopolitics is ran. And that's why I think that it is important and why it was so opposed when we had the potential for a government that did have an internationalist policy that opposed American unipolarity potentially from 2015 to 2019 in this country. Why the establishment closed ranks so much around it is they didn't want that kind of thing to happen in this country, because as an important power broker, right, with sixth biggest economy in the world, it is genuinely still important at time of recording what stance the UK does take on international affairs, and wanting to make ourselves more in line with humane foreign policy is something that we should be looking forward to. It's something we should be fighting for, and why we should absolutely oppose any attempts from this current government to suck up to Trump, which, as you say, as you rightly point out, he is wanting to do. And the pressure from the other benches is very much so as well. Right, Reform UK's political raison d'etre, to me, seems to be to want to make the UK a vassal state of America. That's what the Brexit project was for, to break us away from Europe and closer to the United States and US unipolarity. And so in the wake of that, we can look to this as another opportunity to make connections with the global south, new power centers like China, who have more of an opposition to American unipolarity, which, as we've seen from their desire to be the ones that the exception is made for, we must oppose that. We absolutely must oppose that, and we should take every effort to do so. Labour, it's the party of working people. This was the refrain from Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves throughout last year's general election campaign. The two central themes of their pitch to make the economy better for working people was to drive economic growth and to end the Tory chaos of the previous 14 years by bringing security and stability to the UK economy, branded by Rachel Reeves as Securenomics. Now, the growth that was promised has not materialised as of yet. The UK economy did only grow by 0.7% in the first quarter of this year, and in April and May it shrank by 0.3 and 0.1% respectively. Now, monthly figures do not tell the whole story, but it is still a worry for Rachel Reeves, as this is far from the highest sustained growth in the G7, which was Labour's central mission during the election campaign. One of the key drivers of economic growth under the last Labour government was the finance sector. Banking liberalisation from the late 80s, known as Thatcher's Big Bang, gave the UK economy a boost in growth up until the financial crisis of 2008, after which tighter regulation was put into place to prevent such a crisis from reoccurring. In her quest for growth, Reeves is looking to scale back some of this regulation to create her own bonfire of red tape. She outlined her plans to financial sector bigwigs at Mansion House last night.
And today we can go further by announcing the Financial Services Growth and Competitiveness Strategy, including my Leeds reforms, named after one of the UK's great hubs for financial services, and the city that I have been proud to represent as a Member of Parliament for the last 15 years. These are the most wide-ranging package of reforms to financial services regulation in more than a decade. At Mansion House last year, I said that we must regulate for growth, not just for risk. We are delivering today on that commitment while continuing to protect financial stability so that the benefits of a thriving, growing financial services sector can be realised for people all over Britain. Let me set out the details of that package in 4 parts. First, I am rolling back regulation that has gone too far in seeking to eliminate risk. Second, I am delivering targeted changes in the areas where the UK already has particular strengths. Third, I am making changes to capital requirements to unlock more productive capital. And fourth, I am introducing measures to boost retail investment so that more savers can reap the benefits of UK economic success.
So are these sensible cuts to burdensome regulation or the basis for the Big Short Part 2 electric boogaloo? Yesterday in the Financial Times, Rachel Reeves expanded on the rationale for her proposals. Risk, like most things, can be good and it can be bad. It's not good for an economy to bear too much risk, as happened in the lead-up to the global financial crisis when bad lending built up, assets collapsed, and working families paid the price. The protections that were put in place in the years that followed were the right thing to do, with better protections for consumers and more accountability injected into the system. But more than a decade on, the pendulum has swung too far in the opposite direction, with an excessive focus across our economy on stamping out risk entirely. No other globally competitive financial services hub imposes such relentless bureaucracy on its businesses, and nor should we. This culture of risk aversion to the point of an obsession with stamping risk out in all of its forms is not an approach seen in any of our competitors. It is bad for business, bad for growth, and bad for working people. Now, I'm no banking expert, but this doesn't seem very securonomics to me. One of the biggest changes in the reforms is to tear up the ring-fencing regulation which separates retail from investment banking, initially set up to protect consumer deposits from the risk associated with investment banking, which was what led to the famous queues of consumers withdrawing their savings from banks that had gambled consumer deposits in investment markets and lost in 2008. The original ring-fencing regulations were hotly opposed by the big banks such as HSB, Santander, Lloyds Banking Group in 2011, and they have lobbied for their removal, to which Reeves will be consulting on in the coming months. Now, before the election, the Labour Party's financial services plans were drawn up with advice of executives of both Barclays and the London Stock Exchange, which may shed a light on who has the ear of the Chancellor. Those plans were also drawn up by previous City Minister Tulip Siddiq, who was replaced this year by Emma Reynolds MP. Last year, Novara Media ran an article delving into the backgrounds of Labour's parliamentary candidates with backgrounds in lobbying. At the time, we reported that Emma Reynolds was a managing director of a lobby group called The City UK. She's overseen public affairs as well as policy and economic research for the organisation, which describes itself as, quote, industry-led body representing UK-based financial and related professional services. Now, you don't need to be a genius to work out that having a city minister, who is quite literally a lobbyist for the city, for a lobbying company called The City UK, might have a tiny bit of a conflict of interest here. She was confirmed by the Financial Times to be leading Reeves's review of both ring-fencing rules and potential reforms to the Financial Ombudsman Service, a consumer protection agency which the industry have complained as acting as a quasi-regulator. Good luck, working people. Luckily for us, the Treasury have announced they're helping people onto the housing ladder. No, not by bringing prices down, unfortunately, but by loosening mortgage borrowing requirements. The Treasury said this on Twitter earlier today. First-time buyers will be supported to get onto the housing ladder, with the Bank of England allowing more lending at over 4.5 times a buyer's income. This reform could help 36,000 more people buy a home over its first year. And that, as you see there, the graphic explaining there on the tweet as we've seen. Now, it's worth pointing out that adding more demand-side subsidy, all it does is push up house prices. They've continually tried this. Government after government has sought to put money into the pockets of people to make it easier for them to get on the property ladder, to become a first-time buyer. And they've done it continually with demand-side subsidy. And all it's done, right, with things like Help to Buy, for example, is push up prices for housing whilst actually not making it that much easier for people to be able to get onto the property ladder. The people who this really helps, the people who it really helps to just allow them to borrow more, to be closer to being a subprime mortgage holder, for example, or to have access to things like extra cash for Help to Buy or help with a deposit or no deposit in some cases, the people that it actually helps are the high earners who can pass a mortgage affordability assessment criteria, which is essentially based upon whether you can pay back a mortgage, which is entirely around your monthly income, right? It's those people with a high income, the Henrys of this world, who don't have the cash on hand for the deposit, who really get helped. Like, these are mostly kind of middle class, upper middle class young people who can usually get help from the bank of mum and dad anyway. This is a bad policy rather than what we should be doing if we really want to expand the access to housing, is build more social housing, more council housing to improve supply, to undercut the rental market so there's less incentive for landlords to want to just completely monopolize the actual housing stock, which will mean less demand and push down prices overall. Because lower house prices is the only way you'll help working class people onto the property ladder. Because even if you give them access to extra credit, even if you give them extra towards a deposit, they'll still not pass the mortgage affordability assessment criteria unless they have higher wages or the house price comes down. So these demand-side subsidy programs are not a good idea. There's the famous meme, you just need to subsidize demand, and it's a cycle that will keep on going. It'll keep on going unless we actually bring house prices down, lest, of course, we annoy the middle-class homeowner voter base that every single party wants to call every general election. The news this morning also wasn't good for Rachel Reeves either. Inflation statistics for June have just been published, showing an unexpected increase in inflation from 3.4 to 3.6%, almost double the Bank of England's target of 2%, potentially putting the brakes on future interest rate cuts, as well as squeezing the incomes of consumers. This will bite those on low incomes the hardest, as significant contributors to current inflation are transport and food costs, of which the poor spend a larger percentage of their income. The government will need to find solutions to this, and fast. Pollster More in Commons' Shatton Brittard report noted that half of the country believe that the cost of living crisis will never end, which is crazy to think, right? That there are huge swathes of this population that do not think they will ever see an increase in their living standards, that's not good. That's not a good position for a government to be in. In response to this, consensus amongst the population and the data from the US election showing that voters need to feel their life is getting easier and not just be shown it in data, some of Labour's backbenchers are sounding the alarm. Labour MPs asking for the Labour leadership to be more radical on the cost of living crisis. That's 104 MPs to be precise, possibly as a response to the successes of Zohran Mamdani's relentless focus on an economic agenda very specifically. And this is true, right? Like, there are basic stuff in terms of the way in which you approach policy. You have to look like you care, and it has to immediately be felt in people's pockets, right? So one policy that made no sense at all that this government did on coming into office was to reduce the subsidy for bus tickets. So the price for the bus tickets was capped at £3 instead of £2, right? These are the poorest people in the country, the people who Labour purport to want to be governing in the interests for. And whilst you can show that wages are increasing higher than they have under the Tories, which is true, increases in the minimum wage and stuff like that, these are nebulous figures that allow people to see a better ratio of income to cost of living. But unless you have policies that you can point to that directly affect people, like, I don't know, having more subsidy for buses, which, remind you, they cut those subsidies whilst keeping the freeze on fuel duty. So car users who are predominantly richer benefited from this policy, while bus users who are poorer saw their cost of living go up. And it was a deliberate choice by the government. And it saved them, what, £500 million? It wasn't worth it. And that has only led to more people feeling less hopeful about the government that's in charge, and it doesn't look like it has their interests at heart. With that in mind, Curtis, what would your advice to Rachel Reeves be?
I mean, I feel like any advice I give her is not going to be enough to really turn things around. I mean, they've really damaged their Labour brands. I suppose personal advice for Rachel Reeves is to resign and go get a job in some sort of economics think tank or whatever. But broadly, let's talk about what's been going on with Rachel Reeves in terms of the economy. I mean, there's a lot to cover there. I'll try and be brief, but there is so much there. Let's look at growth, for example. Now, in the first quarter, growth was around 0.7%. And according to the ONS, the reason being there was a sort of big hike in in growth was actually because companies really produced a lot more to offset the tariffs from Donald Trump. Of course, remember Donald Trump putting those blanket tariffs on. And in order to not pay taxes on imports, they were like, well, let's just build it ourselves, which, by the way, not a bad thing. So I think when growth came down, it's probably not as dramatic as some people were saying it is, because it looks like, oh, Rachel Reeves has really stuffed things up. When actually she's been very fortunate that growth is quite high. But what's her response? Well, clearly, I mean, look, we know before the general election, a really big sort of pitch to the electorate was, we're going to be the fastest, or we're going to be the most sustainable growing economy in the G7. That was one of her main targets, growth, growth, growth. And she hasn't got that. Now, what's she going to do? Well, she's kind of falling back on the typical neoliberal economics, which is trickle down. And by the way, she used that term herself. So going to the City of London and calling for deregulation is classic Thatcherism. And basically what she's trying to do is go back to the Blair years, even to the 80s, where basically, remember when Tony Blair or sort of the new Labour government said, we don't care if the rich get filthy rich, it doesn't really matter. Because in terms of, the spreadsheets, it might look good, right? If the richer get richer, the post record profits, growth numbers might go up. And then she can, say to the people, look, I've done my job. We're a very fast growing economy. And by the way, that only means something to the media commentariat and the journalists who will say, oh, well done, Rachel Reeves, you've managed to grow the economy by 0.4%. What does that mean to the average person? Okay. You go to them and say, Rachel Reeves has grown the economy by such and such percent. They'll say, I don't even know what that means. Right? They don't care. And to sort of expand on your point, what you said earlier, people need to feel a difference, right? It's no good saying to people, look, this is what I've done for you. And by the way, had I not told you that, you wouldn't have known. Then people don't care. It's this sort of technocratic, anti-populist thing to do when right now we're in an era of populism. We've got people like Nigel Farage who aren't using specific statistics and data. He's using broad rhetoric and it works. So to turn around and think that's satisfying, it's not going to be. You really need to radically transform society and make people feel like their lives are getting better and they're getting richer. And sort of mealy-mouthed growth promises aren't going to do that. There's another thing to that as well. And I like to sort of use this example, right? Using growth as a measurement of an economy is not a very good measurement, right? It's like if you want a new pair of trousers and you say, okay, I'm going to measure the length of it, but not the waist. Okay, you measure the length and is it going to fit? You don't know, because it's one measurement. You need all of it. And growth is, by the way, I'm not saying that you should never calculate growth or ignore it, but it only tells you part of the story. A more holistic approach to understanding how well the economy is doing is who is it serving? How is the average person doing? And growth doesn't tell you that. Growth only tells you, okay, the collective value of the country in a given year. But there's a thing within that, which is consumption debts, right? Or consumer debt even, right? So companies can post record profits, but actually it could be from consumer debt, which actually means people are actually poorer, but it looks good on the growth numbers. So this fixation with just growth is a problem. The reason why I don't think this government, I've said it before, haven't achieved the growth levels they wanted to, is once again, it's from the top down. All politicians love to look at the economy through the lens of the very richest. You need a bottom-up or middle-out approach. You need to invest, make the average person richer. They go out and spend more. So yes, growth numbers will go up, but it also means that the average person is doing far, far better. Now, in terms of housing, you're absolutely right. Once again, it's no fundamental change. It is just subsidizing higher house prices. Look, if you want a government that is serious about tackling the housing crisis, they have to be honest and say, look, okay, those that already have assets, we don't want you to have higher house prices. It's great for you. You can sit on your asset and the value appreciates, right? But if you want to actually do something about it, then you're going to have to be honest about it. And look, if you ask me, I care far more about someone being a first-time buyer, getting on the housing ladder, than someone's asset appreciating. So this is essentially, I know it's a lot of things are thrown at you because it's kind of a holistic thing, but I just want to say very clearly that this is going back to Thatcherism. This is supposedly trickle-down economics, which doesn't work. And by the way, Keir Starmer, I think it was when he was running for leader, he said quite literally that trickle-down economics is a piss take. So not only do we have Rachel Reeves going back to Thatcherism, we have another U-turn. So my advice to Rachel Reeves is radically transform the economy, make people's lives better, not in a small way, but in a tangible way where people feel it, or get out.
What's important as well, I think, that people don't quite realize is that the financial services sector is the cost of doing business for everybody else, right? Like our country benefits because we export a lot of our financial services to other countries, right? So their businesses and their consumers, as a result, have to pay the cost for the fact that we are doing their things through the financial services, right? That's the cost of doing business for them, right? Internally, it's pretty parasitic in terms of the way it acts in terms of the rest of the economy, in terms of the actual productive economy, right? So it's only really good as a kind of export market in terms of why we're having these trade deals with China, right? So that's why it only really benefits like the city of London. I mean, that's the people who are really going to benefit from this. Is that actually going to be felt in the rest of the economy? Well, not really. I mean, again, the same communities that were left behind in the Blair years, they'll be left behind by the same kind of policy prospectus during the Starmer years as well, right? There's going to be the same issue they have by centralising too much growth in the city of London. Because not only does it not tell you about population inequality, just the headline GDP figures, it doesn't tell you about regional inequality either. And it's the regions of this country that have really felt all the problems that Labour are losing. It's the Northeast that they're losing. It's the West Midlands that they're losing. It's places in the Northwest that they're losing as well, right? It's these regional areas that have seen underinvestment that their voters are going towards the kind of the populism of reform. And unless they can show real tangible changes to these people's lives, as you've mentioned before, and their communities, right? If they just centralise in the City of London or their new tech Silicon Valley between Oxford and Cambridge, they will lose these important historic Labour voting regions, and it will be very, very difficult for them to win them back. And I just want to push back on one thing that I think we've been seeing in the comments as well around house prices being a result of population. In fact, increasing house prices have not seen a correlation with an increase in the number of people per house. In fact, the number of houses per capita in this country has continually increased. It's never stopped increasing in this country, right? We have more houses per person than we've ever had in this country in its history. So it can't really be a population issue. This is the fact that during the 2010s, we had huge amounts of extra liquidity pumped into the housing sector with low interest rates, easy access to mortgages, with quantitative easing, making it easy for institutional investors to create an asset bubble in housing, as well as, of course, the fact that we gave people a bunch of subsidy to get onto the housing ladder through things like Help to Buy as well. It's the fact that it's become a financialized asset. It's been a store of value for the rich, for people who engage in money laundering, for example, for foreign entities to put their money into and see it increase. It's an infinite money glitch if you don't actually have a government with an interest in reducing house prices because of things like negative equity. That's why the house prices have gone up. It's very easy to blame migration, which a lot of people on the right will tend to do, when, again, the population as it relates to housing, the housing supply is still increasing in that manner as a ratio, as a proportion. If we want to make housing cheaper, we obviously need to increase the supply, as I've mentioned before, but we need to get out of this mindset of financialization, block people from overseas from using housing as an asset, make sure that we are using land use properly, make sure that empty houses get taxed better, second houses get taxed more. I am in favor of loads of different strategies of being able to achieve this, but the idea that it's solely the result of population increase, I think is a bit of a red herring. Now, one of the underreported problems facing Gazans as a result of the ongoing genocide has not just been the access to aid, but how expensive food and basic essentials have become since October the 7th. Palestinians have been sharing the skyrocketing costs of basic items with followers on platforms like TikTok, with some items such as a bag of flour costing as much as $300 in certain areas of Gaza, according to the charity Action Aid earlier this year. It's clear there is an inflationary crisis in Gaza, close to hyperinflation. To learn more, I spoke to economist Frances Coppola earlier today. I started by asking her just how bad the hyperinflation problem currently is.
According to the Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics, hyperinflation in Gaza at the moment is running at about 43% per month. That's slightly below what's usually accepted as the hyperinflation threshold, but it is more of a trend than a level. So in April, it was running at 70% a month. It's come down a bit, but it's still on the same kind of generally very high inflation line at the moment.
Since the 1980s, most people have perceived inflation to be a purely monetary phenomenon. Is this the case in Gaza?
Well, it's a little complicated because Gaza doesn't have its own currency. Um, Gaza uses the Israeli shekel and is also a very cash-based economy. So the Israeli shekels that it's using are banknotes and coins predominantly. There's not a great use of digital currency there, largely because they've got internet outages and huge restriction on electricity supply. There are parts of Gaza where you simply can't do a digital transaction. And so most transactions are in physical cash. Israel fixed the supply of physical cash in October 2023. It imposed a total embargo on any further supplies. So the banknotes circulating in Gaza now are the ones that were circulating in 2023. They're gradually degrading. So if anything, the money supply for most transactions is actually falling. So in that respect, it's not consistent with the kind of hyperinflation that we normally think of, where there's money printing involved. So a Weimar style central bank money printing, out of control, wheelbarrows of cash. It's not like that. It is actually just prices going up and up and up and up. In a way, more and more people chasing the same very small amount of money.
So obviously that is, I'm assuming, because of the siege on Gaza and the reduction in the supply of goods and supplies going into Gaza because of the Israeli blockade. Is there data that shows this?
Yes, absolutely. The chart I put together of the statistics from the Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics showed an absolute correlation between the tightness of Israeli blockades and inflation in Gaza. So going back right to the start of the war, that before the war, inflation in Gaza was actually more or less zero. In fact, if anything, it was slightly negative, consistent with really quite a stagnant and unhappy economy, which is what we know about Gaza at the time. And then the moment the war started and Israel imposed a tight blockade on supply, inflation shot up and was sort of quickly in the 40 to 50% range. It came down a bit during the November 2023 ceasefire. It came down a bit in the middle of 24 when restrictions were relaxed a bit for a while and then rose again when they were tightened. And then in January to March this year, when there was a ceasefire and the blockade was lifted, prices actually fell in Gaza, and they fell rapidly. They fell at a rate of about 30% a month. And then when the blockade was reintroduced, up they shot again. And within a couple of months, we were up in hyperinflation territory. There's no doubt that the principal driver of the inflation in Gaza is Israel's blockade.
So is there no truth to this idea that a lot of the problems that Gazans are facing with regards to access to supply and access to a lower price of goods and supplies in the Strip, is there any truth there being a problem of Hamas stealing aid or anything like that?
I can't see any evidence of that from the figures. Because if Hamas was stealing aid and reselling it at inflated prices, we would expect to see that applying even when there wasn't a blockade. I mean, Israel is using that excuse to justify the blockade, to say we have got to impose the blockade and control aid distribution ourselves, because otherwise Hamas will steal the aid and sell it at inflated prices to fund its terror machine. But in fact, what we've seen is that prices actually fall when there isn't a blockade. It's hard to see how that is consistent with Hamas stealing the aid and selling it at inflated prices.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. The only thing, obviously, you said before is that most people are doing their transactions specifically in cash, and obviously the banknote supply is static because of the Israeli blockade. A lot of people are donating a lot of money. There's been a lot of drives for donations on places like TikTok, for example, just sending money directly to Gazans so that they can use that to buy more food, buy more access to supplies within the Gaza Strip. Now, that might contribute, in my mind, to an increase in the money chasing a certain amount of goods. Is it still worth it for people to be donating their money directly to Gazans, or is it worth going to aid agencies? Or what would you suggest?
Yeah, let's unpick this a little bit, because there is some truth in that. That when people make a donation to Gazans, they're making it in a digital form in some currency, whether it's dollars, euros, stable coins, Bitcoin. All of those are suffering from falling exchange rates versus the physical cash Israeli shekel in Gaza. And that's because right now in Gaza, the hardest money of all is the Israeli shekel. So when you make a donation, a fair amount of that is going to disappear in fees and charges to the few people who are willing to exchange digital money for cash, which they do so at their own risk, given the supply of banknotes is so low. The more banknotes become scarce, the more they charge to exchange digital money for banknotes, and so the more the effective exchange rate falls. And the other problem, of course, is that when you make a donation to people who are desperately short of the money they need to buy food because the prices are rising so much, if you give them money to buy food, that does feed the inflation. So to some extent, the inflation in Gaza is fed by donations. But that's not a reason not to donate, because if you don't, they're going to die. For my money, feeding inflation is not as serious a problem as allowing people to die because they haven't got any money. So for goodness sake, keep donating. I know it's off-putting seeing so much of the money disappearing in fees and charges and higher prices, but I just think we need to keep people alive.
Yeah, that certainly is my opinion on that matter as well. Speaking of which, on a different note, I follow your content pretty closely. I really enjoyed your bits on economics more broadly within the United Kingdom, such as people's quantitative easing. I followed a lot of that work pretty closely. But since I've been following on social media, what I have noticed is a lot of your opinions on Israel-Palestine conflict have developed a lot since October the 7th. Can you take us through what your opinions used to be on Israel-Palestine and how you came to change your mind on a lot of these issues?
I think I would hold my hand up and say that although I have been for many years uncomfortable about the way in which Israel treated Palestinians, I didn't know enough about history to understand really where this comes from. I was appalled, I think, as we all were, by the October the 7th attacks. My position is still that the attacks on civilians were unjustified, although my position is also now that attacking soldiers and military facilities was entirely justified, and that's quite a difficult one. But that kind of was my position at the start, that if Hamas had restricted itself to attacking military facilities and soldiers, I wouldn't have had a problem, and I don't think anybody else would have done, too many other people would have done either. It was the attacks on civilians that were beyond the pale, and they still are. The problem I have now is that Israel's response to that, I think, is completely disproportionate. And the way I see it now is that what Israel is doing now is not about a war. It's not about eliminating Hamas. It's not a military assault at all. It's more about breaking a people with the intention of destroying them. And to my mind, in the 21st century, that's not acceptable. Another thing I would say is that I also now don't subscribe to the belief that this attack came out of the blue. People like to say, well, before October the 7th, there was no war. And then you look back and find, actually, Gaza's been under siege, not even since 2007, but actually way back into the 1990s, that Israel has been blockading it all of that time, including when it was actually occupying it. It was blockading it and preventing its economy from developing. It bombed its airport, it destroyed its seaport, and did all of that before its famous withdrawal in 2005. And the further back I looked, and the more I read about this, the more I realized that actually the seeds of this conflict were laid long ago. And we in the West have enabled a crime that the Palestinians were driven out of their homes a long time ago and have never been allowed to return. And there's never been a just and equitable settlement for what has happened to them. And while that remains the case, there will never be peace in the Middle East. And that's where I've ended up. And I would say that the development of my views has been about those things, about researching and reading more, and at the same time watching what Israel is doing and the things that its leaders are saying and saying, this doesn't sound like just a retaliation to an offensive to me. This looks much more like an attempt to exterminate.
That was me interviewing Frances Coppola earlier today. If you want to read her full article about the hyperinflation crisis in Gaza, you can see that at themintmagazine.com. Keir Starmer has today suspended 4 MPs for an alleged persistent breach of party discipline. 3 of the 4, Brian Leishman, Neil Duncan-Jordan and Chris Hinchcliffe, were part of the new 2024 intake, while Rachel Maskell was elected under Ed Miliband. You may recall that in response to allegations that Labour was blocking left-wing candidates from standing, Starmer said the selection process was simply to ensure, quote, the highest quality candidates, unquote. Critics contended the real priorities were obedience and the ideological alignment with the Labour right. If total obedience was indeed the expectation, it may explain the level of anger from the leader's office. In typical British media fashion, the Times' Kate McCann doesn't name the source for the claim that MPs were suspended for, quote, persistent knobheadery, unquote, but the implication is it's someone close to Starmer. Neil Duncan-Jordan, who is the MP for Poole, has been a prominent opponent of the disability benefit cuts and also organised rebellion against cuts to winter fuel payments. MP for Alloa and Grangemouth, Brian Leishman, also voted against disability benefit cuts and has generally been outspoken against Starmer's leadership. Chris Hinchcliffe is the MP for North East Hertfordshire, led a rebellion against the planning bill, and Rachel Maskell, MP for York Central since 2015, has opposed Starmer on multiple issues, most recently tabling the second reasoned amendment to the welfare reform bill. And now, there's 2 things here. When you look at, for example, the people that they're targeting here, so take Neil Duncan-Jordan, for example. Now, he is, of course, pretty left-wing in terms of the Labour Party MPs on the backbench, right? But he won Poole. Poole has never had any MP that's not a Tory ever. Ever. He is the very first person ever to win for the Labour Party in Poole, or for anybody who isn't even a Tory, right? He's on a razor-thin margin, a razor-thin majority in that particular seat. It's a miracle that he managed to be there. He would have been out there campaigning on the ground, and he rebels a couple of times and suddenly, whip taken away. Brian Leishman, not only been fighting for the kids of Gaza, not only been fighting against the welfare benefit cuts, right? This is a guy who represents the community of Grangemouth, the ones who have been told continually, there'll be a just transition, which should happen, right? There should be a just transition. And yet they've been left out in the cold by a Labour government that won't put in the industrial policy funding to be able to get these people new training and new jobs in the wake of the Grangemouth refinery closing. He has been a champion for these people, a champion for the real kind of root of Labour values. And he, again, for insubordination, has been removed. And Rachel Maskell is someone who almost was in tears describing the disabled people who she's been speaking to who are worried about what's going to happen to them if the PIP cuts were to go through, right? She's an absolute champion. And it's ridiculous that this has been the whip taken away from her. And the timing is crazy too. But the main story for the last day or so has been this massive story, this massive scandal about the Afghan leak from the Conservative Party when they were in office, right? It was dominating the news headlines. So what if the Starmer administration, or what if the Starmer, sensible adults in the room team gone, I know, we will make sure that that's completely gone from the headlines, completely gone from the popular discourse. Let's discuss how much we really, really hate the disabled and their advocates on our backbenches. Advocates on the backbenches, rather, sorry. Genuinely crazy stuff here from people who apparently are the quote-unquote sensible centrists. Now, a senior government source told The Times that Maskell was organising an emergency debate on Gaza, quote, which the whips think that we'll lose. Of course, obviously we know Starmer and his allies will seek to portray this. In case you missed it earlier this month, this is how he's currently attempting to portray himself, as a hard bastard. To be honest, though, I think it comes across as the exact opposite. I think it only reinforces the idea that he's weak and not really in control, especially with the recent polling showing Labour on 15%, level with a hypothetical Corbyn-Sultana party that doesn't even exist yet. And what's important to point out as well, right, is that all of this, especially with the welfare policy, with the welfare bill to cut PIP from the disabled, they had 9 months with which to win over backbenchers, right? It's the leadership's fault that they didn't bother getting round a table with the backbenchers to ensure that it would go through. They waited until the 11th hour, the very last minute, to even speak to the people who they would need the votes of in Parliament. And then when it all goes wrong, when their failure of leadership, when they're too busy, when Keir Starmer is too busy swanning off around the world, acting Billy Big Bollocks with all the international trips he's going on, all the leaders that he's speaking to, he can't speak to his own MPs to get consent from them for the bills that he's trying to pass, which again was not in the manifesto. The manifesto commitment was to have the disabled at the heart of everything that they do, to listen to their voices, to uplift their voices. And what is it about this government where they just break every single promise? The manifesto just essentially made out of toilet paper at this point, when so little of it becomes policy, right? And I've even seen incredibly pro-Labour people calling this the outrage, that they're expecting backbenchers essentially to undermine the manifesto that they were elected on. It's one thing to rebel on something that was a manifesto commitment that at least some people would have voted for you for because you had the rose next to your name, because you're a Labour Party representative, right? But no one is voting Labour on the expectation they're going to break manifesto commitments. They're going to undermine the spirit of their own manifesto, right? It's absolutely beyond the pale that for something like rebelling on the welfare bill, the people having the whip removed for it, absolutely beyond the pale. Apparently, Rosina Allen Khan has been removed her trade envoy role over this kind of stuff as well. She was an A&E doctor who was working alongside her MP's duty during the pandemic as a key worker. But because she's been rebellious, potentially, apparently, somebody who had to leave her position on the shadow cabinet before the election because she disagreed with Wes Streeting's policy on the NHS, no, she gets the warnings and the shot across the bows as well. And quite frankly, these people are too good. These people are too good for the Labour Party. I actually think it is an important point that these people have the whip removed, because it shows that these people are too good for the Labour Party and they should be elsewhere. I welcome them. I know that Rachel Maskell has said she doesn't want it to be anything other than a Labour MP, and I respect her wishes. But I'm asking all the other ones, if you are so morally set in your particular position on important things such as the welfare of the disabled, on the genocide in Gaza, then there are parties out there that align with your values that you can join and that you can oppose the Labour government by. That is my honest opinion on this. I really want these guys to join other parties because, again, the Labour Party, this Labour government under Keir Starmer, it does not deserve people like Rachel Maskell and Neil Duncan Jordan and Brian Leishman. It absolutely doesn't. Now, Curtis, what do you think? Is this a sign of desperation, or is this Keir Starmer really being the hard bastard he says he is?
He's not a hard bastard. Certainly don't think he's hard. Maybe the latter. It is desperation. In fact, it's been desperation probably since the first couple of months in government, right? I mean, they haven't really, they've done U-turns en masse, they keep making mistakes, they're incompetent. So I think this whole government has been, to be honest, a complete shit show. It is wild to me that you're going to suspend 4 MPs for standing up against disability cuts. And you're absolutely right, by the way. It wasn't in the manifesto, which is so ironic that they say that, because the 2-child benefit cap, right? They were saying, well, you were elected on this manifesto, you have to vote with us. Which, by the way, I don't buy that. I don't buy the argument that, well, you were elected on this particular manifesto, therefore you had to go with it. Because let's be honest, majority of people don't read manifestos from cover to cover. The amount of times that people vote for a party and then they do something else and I can't believe they've just done that. What really matters is an MP represents their constituency, right? So if you're an MP and someone comes into your local surgery and says, I'm really worried about these disability cuts, please don't vote for it, it's going to destroy me. Is that MP expected to then go to Keir Starmer and say, yep, I'm right with you on this? No, they're going to say, look, my constituencies have said this, and also it's morally wrong. To sort of cart back to what you were saying before there about these high quality candidates, we all know it's a load of bullshit. It's nothing to do with high quality candidates. We've seen dud after dud after dud. Briefcase Labour wankers. That's all we've seen, right? Because what they wanted was to create carbon copies of Keir Starmer or Morgan McSweeney, those that would just be loyal. And Keir Starmer's that bad, he's that sectarian, that he's annoyed the so-called moderates in the party. I mean, Rosie Khan, I mean, she's really popular with the centre-left. To go after her is insane. It's wild to me. So he's making so many enemies. I mean, there's 104 MPs who are saying, maybe we should actually start looking at people's material conditions a bit more seriously rather than tinkering around the edges. And maybe you could say it's to do with the Mandani effects. Maybe it's other things. Maybe it's the polling. I mean, obviously that recent poll that came out that had Labour on 15%, a non, I mean, it's kind of a non-party, this Jeremy Corbyn Zara Sultana, because it's not started yet. There's no name and yet they were level pegging in one poll. I get it. It could be an outlier. Maybe people within the party are looking at that and thinking, actually, the polls before which showed Labour so far behind, we didn't really believe that. Reform are only doing well because they've got that wind in their sails. But when it comes to general election, that's when the real campaign happens. And maybe they're thinking, actually, we're getting real big vote splits on the left, not just the rise of the Greens, but again, this new hypothetical party, or sort of hypothetical anyway. Keir Starmer's making enemies everywhere because he is essentially just a vacuum of any sort of principles. He goes where the wind goes, or rather, he goes where Morgan McSweeney goes. And I wonder if this is Morgan McSweeney. I mean, it probably is his hand, right? Which is funny because there were reports not too long ago that there was a fallout between Morgan McSweeney and Keir Starmer over the 2 job benefit caps. Starmer didn't want to go with it, go through with it, and Morgan McSweeney did. So I wonder again if it's Morgan McSweeney who's hell-bent on cutting disability benefits. And in terms of being strong, right? Telling people that you're a hard bastard or you're strong shows that you're weak. I agree with your assessment. It's incredibly weak, right? Do you know what strong is to me? Strong, or strength, is going after the powerful, is going after the billionaire class and the corporations, right? It's going after their own donors. Now, of course, Labour shouldn't be getting big money donors from corporations and health insurance companies and oil companies. They shouldn't be doing that, but we are where we are. I'd say what strength would be, thank you for giving us money. We're now going to raise your taxes. Oh, but no, they always go after the most vulnerable. They always want to cut benefits, and especially on disabled people. And they always dress it up. And this is not just Labour, this is every politician. They dress it up as, we're making the tough decisions. It's not a tough decision. It's an easy decision. If it was such a hard decision, then why do successive governments keep on doing it? Going after unemployed people, working class people, and people on disability benefits. If it was such a hard decision. A real hard decision is to go after the powerful, right? The wealthiest in society and say, do you know what? We are going to take more money off you by taxing you, and we're going to redistribute it, right? And it's going to piss off the media pundit class because they're all funded by these billionaires. It's going to piss off all the think tanks. It's going to piss off most of Parliament. But I tell you what, if Keir Starmer was actually strong, he'd go after those people. But no, he doesn't. He goes after the most vulnerable because he is a weak, pathetic man with zero principles.
Percent right. You're 100% right. He's weak, he's tiny, he's insignificant, and that makes him act like he is absolutely as I said, Billy Big Bollocks before, right? It makes him act way above his station, right? I've got a couple of quotes here. So first of all, this is what the Labour manifesto said about the disabled, and I quote, "Labour is committed to championing the rights of disabled people and to the principle of working with them so that their views and voices will be at the heart of all we do." And yet, someone who actually has the interest of the disabled at the heart of all they do, right? Someone who a Labour source described as like removing the whip from Mother Teresa, and described, and I quote, that the Labour right are crackers for wanting to remove the whip from Rachel Maskell with regards to this, right? Like someone who actually has the interest of these people at heart. What the manifesto said, removing from whip the whip, is absolutely crazy. It's crackers. It absolutely is crackers. It's absolutely the correct description. It's absolutely the correct description. And as I said, it just shows you just how weak that this government is. Because Blair never had to do this. Blair didn't mind when people were rebelling, had a giant majority. That's what they were deliberately trying to triangulate votes for. Maximize the size of the majority, ensure that rebellions are essentially impossible. And their policy was so awful. It was so depraved, right? It was so completely morally bereft that even with a giant majority, there were still enough people who had a moral compass to rebel against it. And what's the punishment for them? We are going to remove the whip from you. It's, again, Blair never had to do this. Starmer has to do this, not only because he's weak, not only because he's insignificant, not only because he's scared of his backbenchers, right? But also because he's a bad leader. He's a bad leader. He blames his subordinates, right? He blames his subordinates, and he lashes out at people when he doesn't get his way. That is not leadership. This guy, who people like Tom Baldwin, his biographer, consistently tried to tell us, oh, he's a decent man. Lewis Goodall always said he wants to be a decent, normal guy in his Substack article. Keir Starmer's a monster. He's a monster, an authoritarian. He's a control freak. And quite frankly, he demeans the office that he holds. He demeans the role of leader of a Labour Party, which should be a collective movement of the workers of this country, a mass movement, and it's turned into the Starmer project, right? It's turned into Keir Starmer's own vanity project. And if he doesn't get his way, if other people make him look silly, he lashes out. It's weak. You're absolutely right, it's weak and pathetic. Thank you very much, Curtis. Thank you, everyone, for joining in as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I did enjoy both our rants at the end there. You know, any opportunities I can stick it to Keir Starmer, I will. And enjoying the Billy Big Bollocks, I thought that was quite funny. Lots of names we've got for Keir Starmer. But you're a fantastic show. And once again, I really appreciate spending time hosting with you tonight.
It's an absolute pleasure, Curtis, an absolute pleasure. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.